I still remember the first day I walked into that office, clutching my brand new notebook and a coffee I picked up on the way, trying to look more confident than I felt. The building was one of those corporate towers with glass walls that made you feel like everyone could see right through you. I was both excited and nervous. This was supposed to be the job that finally gave me stability. After a string of temporary gigs, I thought I had landed somewhere I could grow. Then I met my boss. She walked into the room wearing heels that clicked on the tile like a warning signal. Her smile was thin, almost forced, and the way her eyes scanned me up and down made me feel like I was being measured, not welcomed. She introduced herself quickly, barely looking at me before turning to bark an order at someone else. Right then, something inside me shifted. I knew this woman was going to be difficult, but I didn't realise just how toxic she would become. At first, I brushed off the sharp tone and the way she corrected me in front of others. I told myself it was just nerves, or maybe her way of testing me. I wanted so badly to prove myself that I ignored the knot in my stomach that formed every time she walked by my desk. I kept my head down, took notes, stayed late, and answered emails at night just to show her I was dedicated. But it never mattered. No matter what I did, she found something wrong. I remember one morning I came in early, proud of a report I had polished the night before. She didn't even glance at it before tossing it back on my desk and saying, "Do it again. This isn't what I asked for." Except it was exactly what she had asked for. Everyone around me heard it, and I wanted to sink into the floor. That humiliation stung more than I care to admit. Over time, the little things piled up. She'd make comments about my clothes, my tone of voice, even the way I organised my desk. She always managed to say it loudly enough so others could hear. It wasn't just criticism. It was designed to cut, to make me feel small. I started to dread Mondays, then every single morning. I remember sitting in my car at the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, forcing myself to breathe before walking in. I'd think about calling in sick, but I couldn't afford to lose the paycheck. So I kept showing up, even though I felt pieces of myself breaking off bit by bit. What made it worse was how she pretended in front of upper management. She was all smiles, polished presentations, taking credit for the work we did as a team. The same woman who shredded my confidence behind closed doors would bat her eyes and charm the executives like she was some kind of role model. I hated how convincing she was. How nobody seemed to see through it. I started to question myself. Was I too sensitive? Was I imagining the malice in her words? But then I'd catch the sympathetic glances from my co-workers, the way they avoided her when they could. I wasn't alone. They felt it too. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop, exhausted and numb. I thought about quitting, but rent was due. Bills were piling up, and I didn't have the luxury of walking away. That's when I made a decision I didn't realise would change everything. I wasn't going to fight her directly. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. Instead, I decided to watch, to wait, and to let her destroy herself. The days blurred together after that, but I started paying more attention, not just to how she treated me, but to how she treated everyone else. It became clear that I wasn't her only target. She thrived on control and intimidation. If someone made a mistake, even a small one, she'd tear into them in front of the whole team, making a spectacle out of their error. I noticed how people stopped speaking up in meetings, how ideas were left unsaid because nobody wanted to risk her wrath. It was like she poisoned the air in the office, and we all breathed it in day after day. I remember watching one of my co-workers, Jason, hand in a project he had stayed late for an entire week to finish. He looked proud, even a little hopeful, like maybe this time he'd get some recognition. Instead, she smirked and said, "You call this effort? Do it again? I saw his shoulders sink, and in that moment, I recognized the same hollow feeling I carried home every night. It was strange, but noticing others go through it made me realize I wasn't imagining things. She was cruel, plain and simple. The more I observed, the more I realised how much she lied too. In meetings with upper management, she'd boast about progress, take credit for strategies she barely understood, and whenever there was an issue, she'd point fingers at us. She crafted this perfect image of herself as the backbone of the department, when in reality she was the one breaking it apart. I kept my distance, answering her questions politely, never giving her a reason to single me out more than she already did. But inside, I was seething. I had always believed in hard work paying off, in being fair, in respecting people who worked alongside you. She made me doubt all of that. Some nights, I'd go home and sit in silence, my dinner going cold on the table, replaying the day's events in my head. I'd hear her voice, sharp and dismissive, echoing even when she wasn't there. It was exhausting, not just physically, but mentally. And yet, I held on. I told myself I had to. I couldn't quit and let her win. One thing I've learned is that people like her always leave cracks in their perfect facade. And when you see those cracks, you realise the whole structure is weaker than it looks. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where she scolded me for something that wasn't even my responsibility, I caught the expression on our director's face. He didn't look impressed. In fact, he looked annoyed, almost suspicious. That was when the idea formed in my mind. I didn't need to do anything dramatic. I didn't need to yell, to fight, or even to complain. I just needed to let her keep being herself. Eventually, she'd expose who she really was to the people who mattered. From then on, I watched her even closer. I noticed how her stories didn't always line up, how she promised things she couldn't deliver, how she manipulated situations to her advantage, and I made mental notes of it all. The best part was, I didn't have to lift a finger. All I had to do was wait. It's almost funny looking back, because once I made that decision to step back and just watch, I started to notice everything she did with a new kind of clarity. It was like pulling back a curtain and seeing the whole show for what it really was. She micromanaged us to death, making tiny changes to projects just so she could claim ownership. But when deadlines approached, she'd disappear into her office, leaving us scrambling. She loved to hold last-minute meetings, dragging everyone in after 5 o'clock, knowing people had families to get home to. But she didn't care. Control was her drug. And the more I watched, the more I realised that she couldn't keep up the act forever. One morning, I came in early and saw her office door open. She wasn't there yet, but her desk was a mess of sticky notes, coffee stains, and half-written reports. For someone who preached organisation, it was chaos. I stood there for a moment, taking it in, and realised something important. She wasn't as untouchable as she made herself seem. The cracks were everywhere, if you looked closely enough. My co-workers started to confide in me too. Over coffee in the break room or whispered conversations by the copier, I'd hear their frustrations. She blamed me for the wrong numbers again, one said. I can't keep doing this, another admitted. I wasn't alone in my misery, and knowing that gave me a strange sense of strength. It wasn't just me. We were all caught in her storm, and storms burn themselves out eventually. The turning point came during a quarterly review meeting. She strutted in with her usual confidence, a stack of papers in hand, and began presenting results that, to anyone who actually worked on the projects, were exaggerated. She smoothed over mistakes, inflated numbers, and sprinkled in buzzwords she barely understood. I sat quietly, watching the executives nod along, but then one of them asked a pointed question. Can you walk us through the process you used to reach these results? For the first time, I saw her hesitate. Her eyes flickered and she stumbled over her words. She tried to redirect, but the damage was done. I noticed the room shift, subtle but real. Doubt had been planted. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, I felt something I hadn't in months. Hope. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, it felt like the walls she built around herself were starting to crumble. All I had to do was wait, because people like her always revealed themselves eventually. After that review meeting, the atmosphere in the office shifted in a way that was almost invisible if you weren't paying attention, but I noticed. Her confidence wasn't quite as bulletproof anymore. She doubled down on controlling us, snapping at small mistakes and rewriting emails just to prove she was still in charge. But I could see the insecurity flicker in her eyes when upper management was around. It was subtle, like a crack spreading slowly through glass. And the more pressure she felt, the more reckless she became. She started promising impossible deadlines to the executives, knowing full well we'd be the ones stuck pulling late nights to make it happen. I remember one project where she committed to a turnaround time that was literally impossible given the data we had. We all looked at each other in that meeting, silent but panicked because we knew she had just thrown us under the bus. And when the deadline inevitably passed, she didn't take responsibility. She called us into her office, slammed the door and said, "You made me look bad." Her words hit me like a slap. She didn't care about the work or the stress or the hours we had lost with our families. She only cared about how it reflected on her. That night, sitting in traffic on my way home, I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I wanted to scream, to call her out, to tell her exactly how unfair she was. But then I remembered my decision. I wasn't going to fight her head on. I was going to let her dig her own grave. And she was already holding the shovel. Over the next few weeks, her lies started catching up with her. She'd contradict herself in meetings, claiming one thing to the executives and another to us. I started keeping mental notes, little details she forgot she had twisted before. My co-workers did too. You could see it in their faces when she misspoke. The tiny glances we exchanged that said, "She's messing up." It gave us all a quiet kind of hope, like maybe karma really was coming for her. The real breaking point came when she tried to throw me under the bus in front of the director. She claimed I hadn't delivered part of a report, even though I had emails with her approval stamped all over it. I didn't even have to defend myself. The director raised an eyebrow and said, "But didn't you tell me last week that this was finalised?" She froze, and I swear the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. I sat there, calm on the outside, but burning with satisfaction on the inside. I hadn't lifted a finger, but she had exposed herself. That night I finally slept peacefully. For once I didn't wake up dreading the next day. Because I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with her. The morning after that incident, the office felt different. It was as if everyone sensed that the ground beneath her wasn't as solid anymore. She walked in with her usual sharp heels and forced smile, but her eyes darted around the room like she was checking to see who still believed in her. I kept my head down, pretending to focus on my screen, but inside I was almost humming with quiet satisfaction. I had done nothing, yet the balance of power was starting to shift. She tried to reassert control, of course. She called a sudden team meeting, lecturing us about accountability and professionalism, words that sounded ironic coming from her mouth. She paced the room like a general scolding soldiers, but I noticed the way people didn't quite meet her eyes anymore. There was a distance that hadn't been there before, a kind of collective resistance, even if nobody said it out loud. Later that week, she sent out an email blasting us for missing another unrealistic deadline. Normally, people would scramble to defend themselves or silently take the blame, But this time, Jason replied, all with a calm explanation, attaching the original timeline she had promised to the executives. The silence that followed in the office was electric. Nobody said a word, but the tension was thick. She stormed into his office and slammed the door, but we could hear muffled voices through the walls. When she came out, her face was red, and Jason simply went back to work, as if nothing happened. That was the moment I realised she was losing her grip. One by one, people were starting to see through her. I wasn't the only one keeping notes anymore. It was like we were all quietly collecting proof, even if we never spoke about it directly. I began to notice how often she disappeared during critical moments. While we pulled late night, she'd sneak out early, leaving us drowning in work. When questioned, she'd spin stories about being on important calls or handling big picture strategy. But I had caught her once in the parking lot, laughing on the phone with a friend, nowhere near anything important. These small cracks started to widen. Upper management began dropping by more often, asking questions directly to us instead of going through her. At first, I was nervous, afraid of saying the wrong thing. But then I realised something. They weren't cross-checking us. They were verifying her. And the more they asked, the more obvious it became that her stories didn't line up with reality. One afternoon, the director stopped by my desk and asked casually, "How's the team handling the new process?" I answered honestly, careful not to sound bitter. But I made sure to highlight the late nights, the constant changes and the unrealistic demands. He nodded slowly, thanked me, and walked away. My heart raced because for once someone in power had listened. I didn't have to exaggerate. The truth was heavy enough. That night, sitting on my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees, I realised that my plan was working. She was unravelling on her own. And all I had to do was let the pieces fall where they may. The unravelling didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like watching a thread being pulled from a sweater until the whole thing began to fall apart. She still strutted around like she owned the place. But her edges were fraying. She snapped quicker, forgot details she once guarded fiercely, and repeated herself in meetings as though rehearsing lines she no longer remembered. I kept watching quietly, never challenging her directly, never giving her a chance to pin blame on me. My co-workers did the same. We shared silent glances, tiny acknowledgements that we all saw what was happening. There was comfort in that unspoken alliance. One evening, after another chaotic day of shifting deadlines, I found myself staying late with Sarah, one of the few co-workers I truly trusted. We sat across from each other in the dim light of the office, both exhausted. She finally sighed and whispered, "How much longer do you think this can go on?" I shrugged, staring at the half-empty coffee cup on my desk. "Not forever," I said. "People like her always slip." It was the first time I'd voiced out loud what I had been thinking for weeks, and Sarah's tired smile told me she believed it too. Meanwhile, our boss grew bolder in her lies, as if desperation made her reckless. She claimed credit for a client deal Jason had spent months nurturing, going so far as to present his work as her own in front of executives. I'll never forget the look on his face. Anger, disbelief, and hurt all mixed together. But instead of exploding, he simply documented everything, saving emails, notes, and presentations. We all started doing the same. It wasn't a coordinated effort, but it was natural. We were preparing for the moment she'd finally crossed the wrong line. And then it happened. During a high-stakes presentation to senior leadership, she made a bold claim about the department's performance numbers, painting them as better than they were. But someone had done their homework. The CFO interrupted, asking her to show the data source. For a split second, I saw panic flash across her face. She fumbled through her slides, tried to spin an explanation, but the room had gone cold. You could feel the skepticism hanging in the air. Nobody said anything afterward, but the silence was damning. When the meeting ended, I walked out with my heart racing. I hadn't done a thing, yet I felt like I'd just won a battle. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and realized something profound. My patience was paying off. By stepping back, by refusing to fight her on her terms, I had allowed her to reveal herself. And now, the people who mattered were finally starting to see the truth. After that disastrous presentation, the tension in the office was almost unbearable. She came in the next morning acting as if nothing had happened, but the rest of us knew better. Her voice was sharper, her temper shorter, and her need to control every little detail seemed to double overnight. It was like she could feel the walls closing in and was clawing for a way to hold them back. I kept my composure, answering her questions politely, doing my work, never giving her a reason to single me out. But I could sense she was watching me closer too. Maybe because she suspected I wasn't as beaten down as I used to be. One afternoon, she cornered me in the hallway. Her eyes narrowed. "You seem awfully quiet lately," she said, her tone laced with suspicion. My heart pounded, but I forced a neutral smile. "Just focusing on the work," I replied. She studied me for a second longer before walking away, and I exhaled only when she was gone. It was clear she was unraveling, and paranoia was part of it. Meanwhile, management was getting more involved. They started holding one-on-one meetings with team members, something they had rarely done before. When it was my turn, I sat across from the director, palms sweating, unsure how much I should say. But he didn't ask leading questions. He just said, "How are things going for you here?" I hesitated, then spoke carefully. I didn't complain directly, but I described the constant changes, the late nights, the impossible expectations. I made sure to keep my tone calm, factual, like I was simply stating reality. He listened, nodding slowly, and thanked me for being honest. When I walked out of his office, I felt lighter, like maybe my voice had finally been heard. Around this time, I also started to notice her making careless mistakes. She sent emails with contradictory instructions, forgot to follow up with clients, and even missed a meeting once, something she never would have allowed from any of us. We all noticed, though none of us dared to say it aloud. It was like watching a queen lose her crown piece by piece. And then came the rumour. Whispers spread that upper management had hired an outside consultant to evaluate our department. She pretended to welcome it, calling it an opportunity to showcase our strengths. But the look in her eyes told a different story. Fear. For the first time since I started working there, I felt a surge of genuine hope. I wasn't naive. I knew these things took time. But the momentum had shifted. She was no longer the one holding all the power. That night, as I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea, the city lights flickering around me, I let myself smile. For so long I had felt powerless, trapped under her shadow. But now, without lifting a finger, I was watching her destroy herself. And I knew deep down it was only a matter of time before she finally fell. The consultant arrived a week later, and suddenly everything in the office felt like it was under a microscope. He was polite, professional, but sharp. You could tell he was the kind of person who noticed everything, even the smallest inconsistencies. Our boss tried her best to charm him, plastering on her sweetest smile, parading us around like trophies and taking credit for projects she barely touched. But behind that thin mask, she was sweating. I could see it in the way she fidgeted with her pen during meetings, or the way her voice got tighter whenever someone asked a direct question. The consultant didn't spend much time with her, though. He spent time with us. One by one, he pulled team members aside for private conversations. When it was my turn, I sat across from him in a small conference room. my palms damp against the notepad I clutched like a shield. He asked simple, open-ended questions about workflow, communication, and processes. I chose my words carefully. I didn't vent or complain, but I spoke the truth. I mentioned how often priorities changed at the last minute, how deadlines were promised without our input, and how credit didn't always land where it should. He didn't react, just nodded, scribbling notes. When I walked out, my knees felt shaky, but deep down I knew my honesty mattered. Later that day, I overheard Sarah's laughter in the break room, something I hadn't heard in weeks. She whispered to me afterward, "I told him everything." I wasn't surprised. We were all ready for someone to finally listen. Meanwhile, our boss grew more erratic. She snapped at us for the tiniest mistakes, demanded updates every hour, and even accused Jason of deliberately undermining her. But the more she tried to control, the more she exposed her paranoia. The consultant watched quietly, and I could tell he was piecing it all together. The moment that sealed her fate came during a group meeting. She was presenting a timeline she had clearly fabricated, claiming we had hit milestones weeks earlier than we actually did. Before anyone else could react, the consultant leaned forward and asked, "Can I see the supporting documentation for that?" Her face went pale. She stammered, flipped through her binder, and tried to dodge the question. But everyone in the room knew she had been caught. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the scratching of his pen against paper. After the meeting, the office buzzed with quiet energy. We didn't say it out loud, but we all knew the tide had turned. That night, I lay in bed replaying the moment in my head, feeling an almost guilty thrill of satisfaction. I hadn't plotted, I hadn't schemed, I hadn't even spoken out of turn. I had just waited, patient and quiet, while she built her own trap and walked straight into it. For the first time since joining that company, I felt like justice was closer than ever. After the consultant's visit, the air in the office grew heavier, almost electric. It was as if we were all waiting for the thunder after a lightning strike. Our boss pretended nothing had changed, but the cracks were spreading too quickly to hide. She barked orders louder, scheduled unnecessary meetings, and copied executives on every email as if to prove how in control she was. But it only highlighted her desperation. I remember one morning vividly. She stood at the front of the room during our weekly update, rattling off numbers that didn't make sense. Her hands shook slightly as she clicked through the slides. Normally, we would sit silently, heads down, pretending to believe her. But this time, I noticed Jason raise an eyebrow. Sarah scribbled something quickly in her notebook. Even the newer employees, who once looked terrified of her, exchanged quiet glances. It was like we had all silently agreed. We weren't buying her act anymore. What surprised me most was management's behaviour. They stopped relying on her summaries and started coming directly to us. The director casually dropped by my desk again, asking for specifics on a project she had already boasted about. I told him the truth, gently but clearly. His nod told me everything. I wasn't the only one they were double-checking. Each time something didn't match, her credibility shrank. One Friday, she snapped during a team call. A simple question about deliverables sent her spiraling into a rant about loyalty and respect. Her face flushed, her words sharp, and for the first time, she lost her cool in front of a senior executive who had joined the call. When the screen went silent after she abruptly ended the meeting, the chat window lit up with quick side messages. Jason typed me, "She's done." I didn't respond, but my heart pounded. The following week, the consultant returned with a clipboard in hand, shadowing her every move. She tried to act gracious, even cheerful, but her smile never reached her eyes. By then, the entire team was disengaged from her theatrics. We weren't defiant, just detached. like watching a show we'd already seen too many times. That weekend, I sat on my couch with my phone buzzing from group messages. Co-workers shared bits of gossip. She had been called into a closed-door meeting with the director. HR had been reviewing files. The consultant had requested performance records. Piece by piece, it was all catching up to her. I didn't say much, just scrolled and watched because I didn't need to add anything. I already knew the ending that was coming, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely free. Not because she was gone yet, but because I knew her power over us was an illusion that had finally shattered. The Monday after those rumours, the office felt like it was holding its breath. She arrived late, which was unusual, and when she walked in, her smile was brittle, stretched too tight, as though she was trying to convince herself she still had control. She went straight into her office, shutting the door hard enough that we all jumped a little. Normally she thrived on visibility, pacing the aisles and reminding us she was in charge, but that day she hid. Hours passed and none of us were called in for her endless nitpicking sessions. Instead, HR made their rounds. They stopped by desks one by one, asking small polite questions about workflow and communication. When they came to me, I answered calmly, choosing honesty without anger. I explained how expectations constantly shifted, how deadlines were promised without warning, and how recognition rarely went to the people doing the work. I didn't mention her name. I didn't need to. It was clear who I was describing. They thanked me and moved on, and I sat there with my pulse racing, feeling both nervous and strangely relieved. That afternoon, she finally emerged, her eyes sharp and restless. She gathered us for a team meeting. Standing stiffly at the front of the room, her voice wavered as she launched into a lecture about team unity and trust. Nobody said a word. The silence was deafening. Usually someone would nod or mumble agreement, but not this time. We just stared back, and I think she realised in that moment that she had lost us. Later, as I was packing up to leave, I passed her office and caught a glimpse through the glass wall. She was sitting at her desk, shoulders slumped, staring at a stack of papers. For the first time, she didn't look like the untouchable boss who terrified us. She looked small, human, almost scared. That night, I lay awake, replaying the day in my head. I thought about how far things had come since I first sat crying in my car before walking into work. Back then, I thought I'd never escape her shadow. Now, without ever raising my voice, without scheming or plotting, I had watched her undo herself. And though I didn't know exactly when it would happen, I felt certain the end was near. All I had to do was keep waiting. The following week felt like walking through the final act of a play, where everyone already knew the ending. She tried to keep up appearances, striding through the halls with that same sharp click of her heels, but the energy was gone. Her eyes darted constantly. Her voice cracked during meetings, and every time the director walked by, she stiffened like a child, caught doing something wrong. HR's presence became routine. They were always around, sometimes shadowing her, sometimes pulling employees aside for quick chats. I overheard Sarah come back from one of those talks, her expression calm but her eyes brighter than they had been in months. "They ask the right questions," she whispered when no one else was listening. Jason too seemed lighter, even cracking a joke at the break room. It was like the fear that had kept us silent for so long was finally lifting. And she knew it. One morning she lashed out over something ridiculous. A typo in an internal draft email that wasn't even going out to clients. She berated the poor intern who had written it, her voice echoing through the office. Normally we would all keep our heads down, but this time nobody looked away. We all watched her, silent and steady, and I could see the realization flicker across her face. She had lost the power of intimidation. The consultant returned one last time, meeting with HR and the director behind closed doors. She tried to peek in, hovering near the conference room like she belonged there, but they shut the door in her face. The image stuck in my mind, the woman who once held our careers in her hands, now left standing outside, powerless. That afternoon, we were called into a surprise department meeting. She wasn't leading it. The director stood at the front, his expression serious but calm. He thanked us for our hard work, acknowledged the challenges the department had faced, and then announced that effective immediately, she would no longer be with the company. The room was silent for a beat, as if we couldn't quite believe it, and then I felt the collective exhale. Shoulders relaxed, eyes widened, and someone even smiled. She wasn't there to defend herself, wasn't there to throw one last barb. She was just gone. That night, I sat on my balcony, the cool air brushing my face, and let the truth sink in. I hadn't fought her. I hadn't plotted revenge. I had simply endured, waited, and let her destroy herself. And somehow, that was the sweetest justice of all. When I walked into the office the next morning, the atmosphere was unrecognisable. It felt lighter, like someone had opened a window after months of suffocating air. People were smiling again, chatting at their desks without that nervous glance over their shoulders. Even the intern she had humiliated just days earlier looked relieved. Her shoulders no longer hunched. It struck me how quickly a place could change once the source of the poison was removed. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the familiar knot in my stomach. The quiet hum of keyboards, the smell of coffee drifting from the break room, even the sound of phones ringing, it all felt normal again. And normal had never felt so good. Later that day, HR gathered us briefly to assure everyone that leadership changes were coming, that our department would have more support and clearer communication. They encouraged us to speak up if we had concerns, promising we wouldn't be ignored. Their words felt sincere. And though I remained cautious, I felt hope I hadn't dared to feel in months. That evening, as I drove home, I thought back to the nights I had sat in my car, dreading walking inside, the mornings I held back tears in the restroom, the moments when I questioned if I was strong enough to keep going. And I realised something: strength doesn't always look like fighting back with fire. Sometimes strength is patience, it's endurance, it's trusting that truth eventually rises to the surface, even if it takes time. I didn't get her fired with a grand plan or some dramatic confrontation. I got her fired by refusing to break, by letting her own lies, her cruelty and her arrogance expose her. And that felt more powerful than any revenge I could have plotted. Still, I won't lie. There was satisfaction in knowing she was gone. Maybe that's petty, but after everything she put us through, it felt like balance had been restored. More than revenge, though, I felt proud. Proud that I hadn't let her turn me into someone bitter or spiteful. Proud that I had chosen to hold on to myself instead of stooping to her level. As the sun set that night, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, I promised myself something. Never again would I let someone like her steal my peace. If I ever found myself under another toxic boss, I'd remember this lesson. Patience, truth, and quiet resilience can sometimes be the sharpest weapons, and in the end, they were enough to bring her down without me lifting a finger.